I was awoken by the sound of sirens blaring out in the hallway, and was still half asleep when I emerged out of my room to see people running in all directions. I managed to stop someone, and they explained that one of the test subjects had broken out. They ran off, leaving me standing there, unsure of what to do. I made my way towards my post, which was beside one of the 10-inch thick steel doors which are meant to keep our test subjects contained on the lower levels. I practically jumped out of my skin when something began pounding on the other side of the door and was somehow causing dents in the metal. I heard shouts nearby and turned my head to see almost 24 armed guards lining the corridor. They all looked determined as they pointed their guns towards the door. The sounds of screeching metal made me cringe as whatever was on the other side managed to break its way through. I almost giggled as a tiny little penguin waddled through the entrance and stood there, looking incredibly adorable. One of the guards barked an order, and the deafening roar of gunfire echoed throughout the hallway as I turned away to avoid seeing the poor penguin being killed by the bullets. The gunfire quickly stopped, and my mouth hung open as the penguin stood there with a wall of bullets frozen in front of it. An eerie smile crossed its face as the bullets spun around in the air. I tried to shout out a warning, but it was already too late, as the bullets flew through the air and tore apart the helpless guards. I stood there, staring at the pulverized remains of the guards. An agonizing pain shot through my head, and I raised my hand to discover blood cascading from my nose. I locked eyes with the penguin and felt its malevolent gaze boring into my skull. I began screaming as it felt like my head was being crushed by an enormous vice. The pain eased when a solitary gunshot cut through the silence. I wiped the blood from my face to see one of the guards had survived, but the entire half of his body was lying a couple of feet away. He clutched his gun in a shaking hand as a small dribble of blood dripped from a bullet wound in the penguin's wing. A look of abject terror crossed the guard's face as his hand moved of its own accord. His last words before the bullet ripped through his skull was that he had a wife and children. I fled while the penguin nursed its wound and ran down numerous identical corridors and quickly got lost. The sounds of gunfire could be heard in all directions, which were quickly followed by the sounds of the dead and dying. I let out a shriek as the lights went out, plunging me into utter darkness. I used the wall to guide me as I moved carefully along, hoping to find the elevator to the surface. My feet kept colliding with things that were strewn across the corridor, and I winced every time something squashed beneath my feet. I was momentarily relieved when the emergency lights came back on, casting an eerie red glow across the corridor. I stupidly looked back the way I had come and almost vomited as I saw the eviscerated corpses that lay scattered everywhere. I raced up the corridor and almost jumped for joy as I spotted an exit sign directly ahead. I turned a corner and ran face first into a wall of heavily armed soldiers that were blocking the corridor. I was quickly debriefed and discovered I was the only person who had made it to the exit. I was ushered past them and stood there unsure of what I should do. We all tensed up as the sounds of movement could be heard from the corridor I had just emerged from. My eyes widened in terror as a line of blood-soaked corpses emerged and began marching towards us. I spotted the penguin at the very back and realized he was using their bodies as a human shield. The soldiers hesitated before their sergeant barked out an order and they opened fire. I stood there with my mouth hanging open as the bullets tore apart the corpses, and yet somehow they kept coming. The corpses smashed into the line of guards and used their teeth and remaining limbs to attack the powerless soldiers. Their lines began to crumble as, one by one, they had their throats ripped out. I began desperately smashing the call elevator button as it was only the sergeant left alive. The corpses moved aside as the penguin waddled over the pile of corpses. The elevator doors opened and I shouted at the sergeant to come quickly. He shook his head, and it was only then that I spotted the grenade clutched in his hands. He mouthed the words, "Go," as the corpses surged forward to protect the penguin. The elevator door shut just as the explosion sent me flying to the floor. I lay there breathing heavily as it slowly rose upwards and reached the surface. I walked out of the elevator and collapsed into a nearby chair to catch my breath. I rose to my feet as the elevator door closed and it began descending down into the facility. I now stand here, frozen in terror as the elevator ascends once again, while praying that It is the sergeant on board.